My name is Bruce L. Erickson, and I thank you really all for coming. What I'm going to share with you tonight is a culmination of about, actually, I say in some of the papers about 28, but it's actually about 33 years of work, starting out with critical information systems, working with astronaut Gordon Cooper and one of the senior advisors to the Canadian government, Dr. Christian Delot. And the objective tonight is to address the issues of changing times, but changing times from a really broad perspective, and that takes into account a lot of areas that you don't hear discussed in the media or addressed adequately in terms of what I've seen in articles and on the press and on TV and what have you. So hopefully we'll do that job and do that job well. I started giving this particular talk in Sweden, in Stockholm, in December, and then thanks to the request received from the university here at Santa Barbara, addressing the global students at the Global Studies program, looking into their future. And nothing's more scary than a student graduating from a university right now with a bachelor's, master's, or a PhD and go, but there's nothing to step off to when I leave the edge. And you can see that in their face. But I'm trying to give them hope and opportunities and think creatively and address the situations I also counsel students. Okay, on with the show. First of all, what I've advised people in this day and age is that there's one talent that all of you in this audience, if you don't honor it right now, you're going to need to. And I say this to students as well, and that's the powers of discernment and the use of your own intuition. Because regardless of what anybody says, any pundits, articles in magazines, documentaries you see out there, nobody knows really what the future holds. They can all make a guess. You can listen to channeling, you can read New Age magazines, you can listen to, I prefer Bill Moyer rather than Fox News, but however, it still is uncertain territory. And I'm going to digress a little bit with you and say we've always been in changing times. We have always had to face a different reality. And let's just allow a little fantasy for a moment. Let's say I could teleport all of you back to 1890. We're in Santa Barbara, and you've gathered, okay, in this audience to wonder who this person is that is going to talk about what's coming. You probably arrived on a horse, you probably arrived in a buggy, or you walked, or what have you. And if I stood in front of the audience and said, well, in 10 years or 15 years' times, man will fly. The women, you'll have a machine that'll wash your clothes. A telephone will come, you can call your neighbors, and there'll be a disc which you can play, okay, and you'll hear music. I would be laughed off the stage in 2 seconds flat. But the one interesting point, and for those of you who read history a lot, is almost everything we're going through right now, with a few additions, is a very similar circumstances that existed almost 120 years ago. We faced an unbelievably radical change, incredible innovation. In fact, all the innovations, for the most part, that you're enjoying right now and take for granted, including your iPhone, was actually conceived in the 20 years after 1890. In 1906, the picture phone was a vanity mirror a woman held up. It was a cover story in Electrical Experimenter magazine. The internet was not conceived by DARPA, 40 years ago. It was conceived by a Belgium in the late 1890s, and with a very smart vision of it too that parallels what we're having today. Spiritual movements emerged very strongly. Leaders in consciousness and thinking that we ride on the backbone to this very day. They came forth at that time. So if you were to live back in that time, you couldn't have envisioned your future in 1890. You couldn't have, because you would have seen such radical change. And fundamental change actually more than that we're experiencing now. So what I'm going to take you through about 12 steps here. And I call it the sacred wheel of community because that's where we all live. Regardless of the change that we're all faced with and whatever happens in the future, we'll be living in community. We have for thousands of years, and I'm pretty sure that's one thing we'll count on for a long time to come. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to address kind of problems, and solutions. And the whole idea of this talk in this evening is just to provoke some thought and some thinking. I'm going to talk for about an hour and 15 minutes, and then we're going to take a stretch, and then we will have a dialogue, and we'll have a discussion and talk about what has been brought up here. What do you think? I'd be pleased to know. And where your concerns are, and let's see if we can take a flying shot at addressing some of them. So, if you bear with me, that wheel is a little hard to read from the distance, so if you just track with me here, I'll go through it. At the top here, I've got healer, teacher, students. Well, it's just right at the crest coming up. Is that one thing we all are, is that we're all teachers and students throughout our life. School doesn't end when we left college or university. School has never ended, really. And invariably, we're doing something and we're teaching somebody else. No matter if it's a new recipe in the kitchen, or if it's fixing a car, or what have you. We have roles that are innate in our entire life. And we must realize that, and the thing is that, so if you stop and think about it, we're constantly sharing information with each other. In the process of our communities where we live, the fact is that they're like a living school system. They exist and they will continue to exist. And it's important to really honor that fact, because in the winds of change that'll take its place, it's one thing that we can really count on. And I mean that most clearly. It's interesting when I've lectured and I've done town hall meetings in several states and actually overseas, and I get a whole group of students and I say, okay, what would you like to have? What do you really need? And they all say to me, they said, pretty universally, they said, we'd like mentors. We don't have access to the people, okay, who have I have a particular interest in photography, I have a particular interest in physics, or I have a particular interest in architecture, everything else. I don't have access to those people. You know, my teachers are good, and our counselors and everything else, but I would like to learn and get to know somebody who's really worked in that field. And it's interesting, the state of North Carolina actually embraced that, and they developed quite a mentors program. So I'm urging all of you here is that the fact is that you all have gifts, you all have talents, and I hope you adopt, or let's say, honor them by passing along to someone from the younger generation, because they are there to learn from you, believe me. I have plenty of students calling me, that's for sure. Okay, mind, body, and spirit. Now here is the part that we're very good at taking care of our cars, changing the oil, okay, see if the steering is aligned, okay, and the tires are full and everything else. We've got a whole checklist for that. But we barely have a checklist for our own beings. And one of the things that people have noticed, and you've seen it a lot in articles and everything else, is what's going to take to get through these times is some really clear thinking. And you can't think too clearly if you're not well. And the attention you give to your own mind and body and spirit will pay the best dividend of anything you could possibly invest in. And unfortunately, in our busy lives, okay, we can come up 1,000 excuses not to pay attention. But do you realize what created you? It was an incredible divine spark of someone out in creation, whatever name you want to give it. But all of us are a living miracle of being here, every one of us. But we don't take much time to honor that. And it is very critical for these times. You stop and think, well, let's go back to the 1890s for a second. The human body was subjected to a lot of influences, but not near as much as it is right now. You know, it never dealt with radio frequencies. Toxicity was, yeah, there was a certain amount of it, but not to the extent you have now. You didn't have all the things that were, you know, usually stressing people endlessly, calls, communications, or demands on our time. But now we're living through that, and all these factors are contributing, okay, to that, I should say, dissonance in the well-being of our body, mind, and spirit. I want to say something here too, is that there's a lot of controversy right now going about health and health care, and a lot of expenses that people are afraid of. What's it going to happen? I had a friend recently who had a blood clot on the brain, and they're facing several $100,000 worth of bills, and it's extremely unfortunate. They just don't have really the adequate insurance to cover it. It's staggering. The largest contributor to bankruptcy factor in America is because of health costs. That is about 60–65% of the cause of bankruptcies in America. If somebody has a more precise figure than that, I'd be glad to hear it. However, in that horizon, in that crisis we're going through, I'm feeling that we're going to develop a whole new health paradigm, and one with a lot more common sense than some of that we see today. There was some pioneering work done many years ago by Hazel Parcells, followed on by Dimensions 33 in Australia and a number of other groups. Dr. Tom Rook back there in the corner could probably add a few more names to this, where they just took people simply and they said, what's your acid-alkaline balance? You know, what kind of diet you have, you know, based on blood type or digestive predisposition. What exercise? There's a list of about 7 or 8 of the items. I could actually, if anybody wants a list, I can provide it for them. These simple steps that you do, which most people don't, is the fact will make an astounding difference in your health. In fact, the statistics that I've seen, about 90% of even some serious illnesses go away, but we don't practice that maintenance. However, as I said earlier, we do it for our cars very well. We got a whole checklist for that. But it's amazing how much those simple steps will make. Huge. I've got a colleague who just was in incredible fatigue. Now, what I'm about to say is that I don't mean this as a subscription for everybody. I want to really be cautious with it, but I just want to say there's this, in this particular case, there was this 2 things that were added. One was iodine for the thyroid, another one was sublingual vitamin B complex, and the situation is, Gene just told me he's got a new woman in his life, okay, just for those 2 things. But those are common sense things, and we often forget this. So pay attention. There's devices. I've meant to bring it tonight. I've actually got a device at home. It's not on the market in the United States, but I've been advising the company. It actually sends signals to the brain or the other part of the body and regenerates the cells in that area. And it looks like a computer mouse. It's really good, too. All right. Healthy family life. Boy, now there is a territory that is full of a minefield. You know, it's funny that funny and tragic too. If we look at indigenous cultures or some other cultures in the United States, even Latino cultures, Italians, even back in my family in Sweden, there's this kind of cohesive resilience and the willingness to, while you may not always get along, at least try to resolve things and try to move them forward. What I've seen and what all of us have seen in the United States is this incredible fracturing of the American family. I remember one case where I was at a town hall meeting in Mill Valley were coordinating, and this woman got up in the audience and said, her exact words were, "We've all became real estate millionaires, and in the process we really screwed ourselves." Pretty blunt statement. I thought, what did that mean? It's because our kids couldn't afford to live here anymore. They had to leave. They had to go to Oregon. They had to go elsewhere. What we've done is we've created this wealth in the terms of our holding, but what it is fractured our whole family. And that's a common thing's common here right in Santa Barbara. So the investment we make in ourselves, the next investment is, what's your family ties? And I don't mean this in biological family. It could be extended family, could be a network of friends. It can be adopted family, what have you. There's a study that was originally done by the Canadian Armed Services, which was quite interesting. Because they had to do a lot of survival analysis, they came up with this conclusion. They said, in case of a crisis of emergency, the heroes you read about in the movies who go out and forge it on their own are not likely the ones that survive. On the contrary, the ones that cooperate, collaborate, and even if they don't get along at times, okay, make the effort to do so, their chances of survival are far greater. So my advice on that score is that take a careful look at the investment of the people in your life, because it's going to be crucial in the future. Just as I said in the beginning of this talk, when you enter into the area of discernment and telling yourself the truth, make sure those alliances really do honor and serve you mutually. And that's very important. Don't try to make things work that don't work in the first place. Okay, turn this page. Okay, sustainable community, which is on everybody's, at least in this town, a lot of people are talking about it. My definition of sustainable community is this. Sustainable community is you living wherever you want to live and just make it better and work well for you, your family, your neighbors, and make a commitment to be an active part of making that work. I live up in the Mesa, and there's a marvelous guy up there that a number of you people know. His name is Owen Dell. He needed a really clever thing that was so simple. It was ridiculous. Is that if you drive by the street and you look at these nice houses, what you don't see about a lot of them, in a lot of cases, there's some incredible gardens in back, and I mean really incredible gardens, and more so than you might imagine. And so he said, well, listen, they're growing enough tomatoes to supply, a good share of Santa Barbara. Why don't we work a food swap thing? And every other weekend, somebody puts tables out in their driveway, and we somebody's got lavender, somebody's got tomatoes, somebody's got beans, somebody's got squash, or somebody's got lemons or limes or what have you. Let's do a swap meet. It's interesting just to go up there and visit it and see it. And watch exchange, people who don't even know each other. And they find bonds that they're in common, and their commonality and their interest in the whole community. And the first time I did that, a friend of mine has quite a growing area. Her name is Margaret Carswell, and so I took a bunch of lemons and oranges and a bunch of things from her place, and I said, what's on your shopping list? And she gave it to me. So I went down there to do the swap. Of course, I came back with nothing that was on the list, but a lot of other interesting things, roots and everything else. But the basket was so beautiful, we just wanted to take photographs of it and didn't want to touch it because it was so pretty. And flowers, and there was everything in there. But what a community tool that is. I mean, just that simple little act, and it makes much sense. And by the way, back in the farming communities in North Dakota, they've been doing that forever, okay? We treat it as a new thing here. I want to, I put up on the table up here a few things that are important. I brought some of the best of sure, and later on when we take a break you can take a look at it, is that key key things about creating sustainable community. This is a couple, for instance, that was here actually about 4 months ago, Bill and Zoe, and we need each other building a gift community. It was one of the best lectures I have attended in several years. Bob Banner, of course, as most of you know, on Hope Dance magazine. If you don't know Hope Dance, just go to hopedance.org on the internet. He's got more tools and events and things of interest with regarding building community in this region. We actually have one of the most well-organized regions in the United States, in part to thank to him. This is the, of course, Sustainable World Sourcebook. If you haven't read Yes magazine, by all means, get it. This is a movement that in Britain called Transition Town. There is some active members here in the transition movement where they're changing villages in England. They're actually growing nut trees in the center divides of the roads so that there's a good nut crop that the whole city can enjoy. Just clever little things that people will be able to do. We, when I worked in Monterey Bay, I helped close Fort Ord, which was a collapsing of a town of 36,000 people. Interesting experience, to say the least. But while we're in the process of doing that, we have the Livable Cities program. People International have their convention there. And this one little simple thing that they suggested made a huge difference in Monterey. They said, why don't you just put raised bed gardens, okay, in public spaces so that even the handicapped can take care of the gardens. And once you raise that garden to the height, the same height as the level of the produce department in the grocery store, things change immediately. And I just tell people the only difference between that raised beds garden and lazy acres is the fact is that food is still in the soil and that's getting sprayed by cold water from up above. That little thing makes a total difference, that move. But I urge you to take on, with all of this, there's a subtle message I'm trying to drive home here, is if you look at your reading material, I'm going to get this into media in a short while, but start taking in things in your space and in your area of interest that are going to serve you not only now, but in the future as well. Enrich your diet with things that work. Except the sound system right now is a little... Are you trying to get me to ascend, Brian, or are we...
It's the microphone, it's not...
Okay. All right. Next thing is healer as an artist. I wish I could show you the poster, and you'll have to just envision my visualization of this. In 2000, I was working with the United Nations and on the Global Water Crisis Forum in The Hague in the Netherlands. And you had people from every country represented, every kind of issue imaginable concerning water, scientists, engineers. Actually, the project I worked on, my two organizations I work with, would you believe was the World Bank and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the title of our program was Water, the Bridge Between Science and the Sacred. Can you imagine those two groups going along with a program with a title like that? Any case, but with all that went on in that conference, there was a piece of magic there, and it was a piece of art. Some Indian NGO, unfortunately I can't remember the name right now, simply put up a poster. And this poster was of obviously a husband and wife, the wife carrying a child, the man leading a little boy, probably about 9 years old, and the setting was they were walking in the middle of a dust storm. And under that picture was simply the caption, "In search of water." It riveted the imagination of that entire conference because with that one picture and that one caption, it said everything. It was one of the most powerful ecological images I have ever seen. And if you consider the artists always as the precursor of change, this has often been said by philosophers throughout the ages, is those artisans, you know, Brian is off filming all the indigenous spiritual leaders he can get a hold of. Some of you are painters, some of you have other artistic expressions. Keep in mind, okay, that you are the wayfarers, you know, of change, because in that expression, there was a juried exhibit done by the University of California, not here, but it was down in Los Angeles, where they took juried art of different environmental persuasions and messages and just brought it in to show what the artists could do to get a message across. And there's one picture there of the polar bear in, I should say, being encroached upon by the ocean because there was no more ice floe for it to walk on. Kind of haunting, actually, and very true. So the thing is that what we need to do is pay attention as artists. What is the artist they're saying as to where we're going? All right, and the next step in this charter right here, I think in your paper, down in my notes here, I got healthy media. Down here, I got honest media. Almost an oxymoron right now. But what I find a little disturbing, and I think is the fact is that we've a steady diet of, well, let me back up a moment. When I lecture to classes, I say, have you ever walked across in front of a newsstand and ever saw a positive news, a caption and on a newspaper ever in your entire life? Or walked across and said, looked at all the different newspapers, and has anyone ever said, fabulous day, great time, you know, we're all been blessed? You never have. It's always been negative news. Some years ago, a representative from the Pulitzer family was getting an award from the Commonwealth Foundation in San Francisco. And when they transferred the award to the member of the Pulitzer family, he actually got up the microphone and says, my family wants to apologize to you and the American people. Not the typical type of response you'd get from receiving an award from them. He says it because it was my family who realized back in the 1800s that if you gave a real heavy negative title, it sold more newspapers. And he says, unfortunately, that's been adopted by all the media, and that's what we're bombarded constantly. Internet doesn't matter. And so one of the disciplines that I think that needs to be taken to heart, if we have any positive visualization of our future, if we want to have some sense of hope or some possibility of change, is look at the diet of the media that was brought forth to us. Last night, if you guys want to write this down, Bob Banner went and got a hold of me and he said, Bruce, you got to preview this. You got to preview this. Let me know how good it is, because he wants to consider showing it. It was a video, and I get tons of videos to look at. This is called First Earth. It's all about architecture, ecology, its effect on community and communities around the world. It is one of the best DVDs I have seen in a long while. And it takes place in many countries, and including California, and it shows the impact of how proper ecology and natural design and natural building techniques and using creativity builds community, builds interaction, builds interchange, solves problems, and in many cases doesn't leave people with $1-million mortgages either. I take people oftentimes up to a kind of a hidden place. I take students up there. It's a eco-village and a training ground for teaching students how to build an eco-village and how to do natural building. And a couple of years ago, I brought one of Obama's appointees up there, very high-powered guy with a resume 5.5 miles long and all sorts of accomplishments. And when he learned how the main house in the property was built with $1,900 worth of materials, he was partly shocked. He told me, as David said, I can only stay an hour. Hour went by, he didn't seem in a hurry. Then lunchtime came, he stayed for lunch, stayed. And I thought, geez, I thought he had to get back. So on the way back to Santa Barbara, he didn't say a word. He just sat in total silence, and I thought, well, is this guy mad or something like this? I tried to ask him questions, he didn't do anything else. I'll never forget what he said to me when he got right to Santa Barbara. He looked over at me and he said, he says, after today, the term development will never mean the same to me. I'd like to take most of my education and put it in a paper shredder. It's because that's a good example of a rethink the way we do things. And I think once we adopt an attitude of embracing a lot more healthy media and content, and it starts to stir our imagination as to what's possible, then all of a sudden a lot of lights are going to go off. Because it's going to link you with more people and more people and more possibilities, and then a lot can happen. So if any of you want to contact me after this is over, I wanted to tonight, I was working on a resource list for all of you, but unfortunately time didn't get me to finish it. The next session is science and spirituality. This is where some 100 years ago, if you were a scientist and exploring and it disagreed with the church, okay, you were the first item on the menu on a barbecue. Okay? Gradually over time, a little more truth has been, happen. Of course, we get people who believe in different types of way we've evolved and where we're created, and that debate's still going on. But now there's a bridge in that whole area between physics and religion and science is starting to say, let us consider ways that things can possibly work. And maybe what's been said in spiritual traditions or in some religions is a little closer to truth the way things work. And some of the theologians are saying, geez, this scientists and physicists aren't so crazy after all. That kind of makes a lot of sense, okay? And so there's a gradual emergence is taking place here. But it's also unfolding the real mystery of who we are, because if you start to take a look at physics and you realize how much space there is between particles, all we are is a consciousness that in its divine presence is figured out a way we can manifest a reality with the strength of our own consciousness or thought. And I think this is what eventually will become the conclusion to things. But for the right now, we're sitting in this auditorium and with friends. Anyway, a lot of adventures are out there, and new thinking is emerging. Ecology. This is important, an aspect in this greater wheel of community, because I like this part because this is where a real strength interplays here in Santa Barbara. We are one of the capitals of permaculture education. And if it's Quail Springs Lodge, or if it's the Santa Barbara City College, or the efforts of discussions out at the university, there's discussions all over. And this is a movement that is huge. It is actually permaculture, I think, in my estimation, is the fastest and largest growing educational movement in the world. You don't hear news about it, hardly any stories, but the amount of people that are involved in it is enormous. And within permaculture is the design systems, the information, the science, the practical knowledge that I think is going to hold the keys to vast restoration and vast ideas that will help restore a lot of the damage that has done to the earth. There is a amazing Australian documentary that was made a few years ago about Alex Podolinsky, this one stubborn Australian farmer who single-handedly, using biodynamics, accomplished one of the largest soil restorations in the world, far exceeding anything imagined by World Bank or IMF or the United Nations or what have you. Huge, thousands and thousands, million acres of the Australian outback was restored with his methods. Of course, his methods were a little strange, okay? Pack manure in a cow horn, bury it, leave it for about 6 months, bring it up, make a batch of potions, and you potentize the soil. That would send most agricultural college professors screaming out the door that they've just, actually that challenges every bit of their science, but that's getting more and more accepted. Actually, there's a wonderful movie, One Cow, One Plow, One Planet, done by Peter Proctor's work that is what is countering the Green Revolution and the effects in India. In India, you've had over 100,000 farmers that have committed suicide because our Green Revolution and all our agricultural techniques don't work. And their yields have gone down 30%. They're held hostage to Monsanto or the seed companies and all the other chemical processes. It's a huge human tragedy and done through incredible arrogance. And this one soul, 70-some-year-old farmer from New Zealand went to India and with the help of a Swiss foundation is now educating a nation and helping to counteract that. And he's doing it biodynamically, by the way, and with permaculture. It's a marvelous film if you get a chance to see it. Okay, I love this. Peace and security. Everybody's worried about that, okay? Okay, those folks from the Middle East are coming to get us. Oh God, I won't even go there. When I was writing my notes, I says, what do I say about this?
Bruce, what was the title? One cow, one what?
One cow, one plow, one planet. Peter Proctor. On my flyer, you have my email address and my website. If I say anything in the course of this lecture and you go like, what did he say? What was this reference? Feel free to email me. I will make sure that you get the proper information. Okay, peace and security. When I was writing my notes down to give this talk, I says, what did they say? You know, and then somebody just sort of came out of the blue and said, I think the Bible says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods, and thou shalt not worship false gods. Geez, I think that has a lot to do with security. What is all these wars about? Okay, we want their oil, we want this, we want their mines, okay? We want their, what they have, so we go have a war. Not worship false gods like the industrial military complex of the United States, and the fact that, we're the great warriors. I might add to that end, if you look back the last 60 years, we have never won a war except the Persian Gulf thing in the early 90s, and that was ridiculous. A bunch of equipment out in the middle of an open warfare, and we could shoot at it at will. It was no problem. But Korean War was an armistice. The Vietnam War, which was also started falsely with false information on the Gulf of Tonkin, was a rout. The Viet Cong essentially beat us. In Ethiopia, the warlords made monkeys out of us. Grenada, we shelled our own troops. And the list goes on and on. So with all this might, power, and determination, Iraq and Afghanistan are not going to go down well. And the people there know well. The only reason we're in Iraq is because of the oil. Afghanistan, I know quite what we were there for. I worked with the Japanese many years ago, and they had a much better take on what happens in Southeast Asia and that region of the world. And he says, you got to look back in history as if they were warring there for a long time and nobody's been able to solve the problem. Why are you there? Do you think you're going to be able to solve it? You don't have the skills or the understanding to do so. And I have to tend to agree with them. I think that there's a couple of things I think that should be mandatory in American education for peace and security. One is Marshall Rosenberg's classes on conflict resolution ought to be standard for any degree. And the other thing is a wonderful course, and I've seen young students take it, I've seen much older, is a citizens emergency response training. In other words, if you really have a crisis, a tornado, an earthquake, a hurricane, a major fire, and everything else, what can you do to be effective to make sure that your community survives? It's an interesting, I took the training here in Santa Barbara, and there was an interesting fact that on any given night or day, there's only 21 firemen on duty, about 3 ambulances, and if there were a major disaster here, it would take at least 3 days to get to you, regardless how many phone calls you make. And by the way, the search training is a very interesting training, and I tell my female friends is that there's a bunch of really handsome, good-looking guys, okay, there, that a lot of them are single, okay, so, you know, that's, if nothing else, that's a good reason to sign up, okay. But it's extremely helpful because it also is a course where you're also being asked, what would you do if there was life-threatening issues? There's a system called tirage, which if there's a building collapses, what people can be saved, what people can be injured, and what people most likely will not make it through. And these are hardcore decisions, but anyone who's been in fire or emergency work realizes these are just decisions sometimes you have to make, but you also have to be able to weigh to be effective on the ground and to make as best of the situation as possible, and it's excellent training for that. What was interesting in terms of peace and security, heretofore we've left that to the police department, emergency services, or fire departments, what have you. But as the earthquake and tsunami in Japan have shown, and in other disasters area, it's increasingly dependent on the civilian population to take a role in that. And very important. And there's a cute little anecdote about, well, I shouldn't say cute, that's the wrong word, but a really interesting anecdote about the situation in Japan when everything collapsed and they were trying to analyze block by block what happened and the survivors and everything else. The amount of traffic over the internet and support was astounding. And also interesting enough, one of the key computer software developments to help them analyze the situation did not come from Google. It did not come from the United States. It came from a group in Kenya who had a lot of experience about counting elephants and natural disasters with wild animals. And it was their software engineering that was one of the prime components in the disaster recovery in Japan. How's that for being part of the international community? I've never heard of Kenya as a software engineers. All right, the next step, 10, and I've got a couple more to go, is care for all generations. You know, it's sad in a way how we've divided and stratified our generations in this country. I think that's a weak link because, you know, you see a lot of people living alone, a lot of people who have incredible gifts, a lot of how should I say, well, you know, well, they're so-and-so age, they don't have anything to offer anymore, so if you can forget about them. By the way, one of the most efficient companies in America, consecutively by the Wall Street Journal, is a little company in Ohio, and nobody in the company is younger than 65. It's Bonnie Bell Cosmetics, by the way, if you want to know the company. It consistently wins the top awards in the nation. You know, in societies where I would say you could measure the quality of life. I'm not saying economics now. I'm saying the quality of life and satisfaction that people derive from the way they're living is the fact is it'll come down to the fact of how well they integrate all generations within the community. I took some courses with Dr. Ken Peltier from Stanford a number of years ago, and one night in this very august meeting when everybody was dressed up in their finery, and he was saying that we're here, it was over a issue that the Pew Foundation was going to issue a huge grant to study aging. And Ken Peltier got up in the audience, he says, I'll tell you a study on aging. You know the best anti-aging medicine there is? He says, when people of all ages value people of all ages. And he gave a demonstration. He put a picture up on the wall, and you saw this guy pitching hay. You couldn't see his face, but his physique was like 30-year-old football player. He turned around and he showed another picture. The guy was 87. The real counting touch was he showed a film clip to us about a guy riding a horse, and it looked like something out of a Steve McQueen movie, for God's sake. I mean, he's jumping fences, hedges, and everything else, and going like a maniac. And he said, well, this guy, he's 90 years old, and by the way, he's going on to his mother's birthday party. You know, it kind of shattered the myths and science of what's involved with anti-aging. I think when people have, there's a wonderful story too of the City of Hope in Illinois, where there was an old military base and a section of it that had a beautiful housing area. And what they did is they took kids that were handicapped or disadvantaged in like foster homes and different things, and they took people in upper age groups well into the 50s, 60s, 70s, and they says, if you're willing to be foster parents, we'll provide a house and you'll have a chance to live and take care of these kids. And the results they measured were astounding. People who entered into the program who had medical records of heart conditions and different things and were kind of really questionable whether they could use them or not. They took in these kids and helped them, and 6 months later, where's this heart condition? Where's this angina? Where's this? Gone. The vitality of these people was phenomenal. That, by the way, has been made into a PBS special. It was aired a number of years ago. But it speaks to the fact that when we care, the rewards are definitely there. And I have a guy in our complex. He's, what is Sam? He's about 76 years old. And I've introduced him to a lot of my younger friends. And I said, if you want to go on a hike on the trails, go with Sam. He knows all the trails in the area. The only thing is, if Sam takes you to wants to go on a long hike, bring a passport. Okay, economic sustainability. Now, here's a touchy part. And this touchy part is that I have tried to instill this with a number of investment firms and different things to start thinking about this. But it's amazing how much, it's kind of ridiculous when you stop and think about it, that people take their capital or their assets, whatever they have in their lives, and they ship it off to Chicago or New York or whatever have you, and with some brokerage house or investment banker and everything else, and very little of it stays in the community. I'd like to change that paradigm, and by the way, I'm going to say something here, and I'll go into it in governance and law in the next section, but this is not necessarily easy to do because of the way investment laws work. What I tell people is that take where you are, a city or community, take a compass, go out 100 miles and draw a circle. And within that circle, put a substantial of your investments right there. It's a lot easier to watch, okay? You don't have to deal with a brokerage house, okay, that's just working on commission. Sorry about that, okay? But maybe we can be, okay. But if you invest in the local area, what does that return to the community? One, those investments may be needed to create new jobs, new opportunities, everything else. You're helping to instill the vitality of that community. Your payback is not just only in the dividends. The payback is in the fact is that to all the unseen people that make the quality of life, okay, that you enjoy here. Now, we're very fortunate to live in Santa Barbara, but we don't have a clue about how many different people of various walks and lives that unseen and we'll never know that make life here possible, whether it's fixing the roads, supplying the water systems, driving a bus, you know, the list is endless. And without those folks, if they were all to disappear, okay, our quality of life would change dramatically very fast. And so what we need to more and more look, in fact, there's a chain of food stores in Kansas now that they'll only take in from suppliers within a 100-mile radius, because they want to ensure the quality of the food that they're having in their stores. I, for a while, was a consultant to the chairman of the board of Odwalla Juice Company. At the time, it was the largest natural juice company of America. And even in the mid-90s, we saw a crisis coming in America where Americans would no longer trust their food supplies. They were increasingly concerned about it. And when that shift starts to happen, the situation is, in truth, Santa Barbara County can grow just about anything that you'd want. Maybe not macadamia nuts, okay? Darn it, okay? But just about everything else. Medicinal herbs, you know, whatever have you. So what I'm suggesting here is take a different look at whatever investment portfolio you have. Actually, it's really funny. There's some companies right here in Santa Barbara, tech companies that deal a lot with infrastructure technology. They're doing fine. They're hiring, everything else. You don't hear about any layoffs, everything else. I know some friends that actually work at the companies. They go like, I don't know what everybody else's problem was. We're doing fine, you know. So take a good look there. Now, I saved the most challenging one for last because recently here in town, we had the Center for Sustainable Economics and Law gave a forum here, and I was in attendance to that meeting. And there were two very bright women who came down from San Francisco who did a lot of a study and analysis in this field, and they had some pretty shocking details. And it's very challenging for California because in California, we have some of the most backward legislation and I should say laws, regulations, and ordinance of any state in the United States. And while we're innovators in Silicon Valley, our legal and legislation process almost borders on being retarded, okay? Because it's very difficult to do things in many cases in California. One of the most innovative housing projects ever created practically on the planet was done in Davis, California at Village Homes by Michael and Judy Corbett. While they were praised all over the world and their work was honored everywhere, once they completed that 420 some unit housing program in Davis, they were never allowed to build another one in California again. And if you're ever going up to Sacramento or going up that road, take a little diversion into Davis Homes. I won't say much about it, except if you just walk through how they innovated and how they created this place. And by the way, it was conceived in 1974. You would be amazed. The beauty of it and the way they laid it out is breathtaking. By the way, the homes are worth 30% more than the surrounding area because of that. Nobody wants to leave. But we live in this kind of imputative environment here in California, which is unfortunate. Why do we have such incredible innovation in Silicon Valley? By the way, you know, I get a kick out of the computer revolution and all the creativity that goes on there, is if you stop and think, they never had any rules to begin with. It was an industry mostly was launched by people who hadn't even graduated from college. Bill Gates didn't. Seymour Crayon, the father of supercomputing, I don't even think, I worked with Seymour for a while. I don't even think he even completed his college education. It was, you know, a bunch of guys saying, hey, how can we make this work? There was no peerage system, there wasn't any rules, there wasn't any ordinances or anything else, and the creativity went wild. Can you imagine what the computer industry would be like if they had to pass everything through the Santa Barbara City Permitting Department? Can you imagine what it would be? We'd be having the hand crank on the cash register still. However, there's another side to that innovation which also leads us into law. While all that propagated, there was another phenomenon that took place, and I think it's going to help change the legal system. And that change is this, that after all that growth, they realized they have to talk to each other. My signal has to meet Richard's, you know, it has to reach Cat's. There has to be this interchange and connectivity. All of a sudden, standards were made, but they were made amongst the group of people that were really working in the field, and they had to be very ecumenical about it. That has emerged, and that's what made the industry possible, and so it served its rules. Now, another thing, a takeoff from that is what's happened in Europe, what they call ISO standards. In other words, if you're going to produce a product, there is a criteria by which you meet the quality standards that another country or another buyer will accept, and it has to meet those particular standards. There's all sorts, what is titled systems conditions. And Leif Edvinson, the father of intellectual capital, said to me one day, he said, Bruce, he says, maybe the 10 Commandments could have been considered systems conditions. It wasn't absolute laws, it's what you went on to try to achieve. Sweden's environmental model, the natural step, is based on that. And in all types of persuasions, architecture, its lead standards, is quietly they have moved forward, and I think this is eventually going to influence the legal and regulatory bodies, because already, and let's go back to laws and ordinances and permitting processes, all of a sudden cities are saying, wait a second, we're getting bombarded by this leads business. Maybe we need to adopt what they have set up as a proper criteria for engineering and making a building, instead of us dealing with rules and regulations that are 50 or 100 years old and are no longer appropriate. So law and governance, and unfortunately with law and governance, there's another aspect of it too. As you've often heard from attorneys and everything else, we're dealing with a broken system. And in laws and regulations, it's going to require a really great rethink. There's a lawyer in town here, his name is Douglas Gillies, who said to me one thing that was very profound. He said, Bruce, it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong, guilty or not guilty, okay, or justice is being served, it all boils down to how well you argue the case. And that's truly unfortunate. And unfortunate, regulation comes through Washington, and there's tons of lawyers to figure out how they can circumvent it. It's an endless chase that's going on. So with courage and conviction and understanding and some real good foresight and looking for ideas that work, looking for different role models, as my thoughts here is that all over the planet there are great points of light emerging everywhere. It's important to connect those points of light, because our future and the challenges we face and the changes we face, okay, are going to count on it, okay? And with that, thank you for being here. I don't know what time it is. I wasn't even looking at my watch. Wow. I was right on the mark. I was speaking at the university. Okay, Deb couldn't shut me up the last time we did it at the university. She was like, cut it off first. Okay. Okay, well, just stretch. If you want to get some water back there or do something like that, do so. And I'd like to open up the floor for questions, address some concerns you may have, something you'd like to discuss further. And we'll do that. All right. Well, what I wanted to do in this part was just kind of gave you the whole overview in a little over an hour. And what I wanted to focus on is any area that you have particular interest in, and I can expand upon, or any questions that you may have. I just want you to fire away. Okay?
Genetic engineering, water privatization. Halliburton and Nestle and et cetera.
The water pirates. I got to tell you a funny little story about that. When I went to The Hague in 2000, I also had press credentials, and I was doing interviews for American radio from The Hague. So it gave me a list of names that the normal attendees didn't see, okay? And so I'm scanning it down, and I'm flipping pages and everything else, and I was absolutely astounded to see that the venture capital firms of Sand Hill Road up in Silicon Valley were there in mass, okay? Because, hey, .com went down, but boy, privatization of water, hey, that's a real great opportunity. And at one point in one of my interviews, I said, when people think about privatization of water and use water for that purpose, is they forgot to look into the history of the Winchester and why it was invented. Because you take people's water away, they shoot, okay? And the jury doesn't convict them either. And what happened, the two young people that set off the whole thing in Paraguay years ago when the fight with Bolivia, excuse me. Actually, the sister of the guy that really started that came to my water conference in 2003. And I had a chance to meet with her and talk to her, but that was a bellwether of what those concerns are. Same thing in Britain when they privatized water and people's water rates went through the roof. Water is an unalienable right, but it also carries this responsibility. And the fact is that people who are using it, people take advantage, who are making use of it, what they also need to be aware of, the fact is it bears a responsibility. And it bears a responsibility to infrastructure in terms of delivery, the quality of the water, okay, that people are getting accessible to, and to manage their resources properly. And part of that management is, an equation of the management is missing in most discussions. And that is the discussion about a watershed. And somehow people think in this country like a watershed is some marshland that I'd like to fill in, pave over, and put a development in, without realizing that if you do not have a viable watershed, you don't have water. And that is this is part of that holistic thinking. One of the books I meant to bring here tonight was the mapping of the watershed of the European Peninsula, which was done by friends of mine. And if you really look into the watersheds, you can map the history of a country, of a region, its economy. It's incredible what a wealth of information is. But we don't holistically look at the things. And all these firms that think they're going to control the water rights, all I got to say to them, if it ever came to a crisis, there would be a shooting war. And that's exactly what the UN has talked about, that the next wars will be fought over water.
We're already fighting now in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah.
In the other countries around it, the water that comes down.
Well, yes, and people don't know the story between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and I'm sure you could probably add to this discussion, but quite often the Israelis were pretty cruel to the Palestinians. You know, when the Palestinians were trying to grow their crops, they'd cut off the water because then they knew they had to buy their food from the Israelis, and stuff that was going on behind the scenes, which was just diabolical. So I definitely don't support Israel's position in a lot of the things that they've done.
The U.S. are already being fought right now over water.
Oh, yes.
The Himalayas is not going to help that whole area.
No, there's some good friends of mine. They're Helen and Newton Erickson. They are the preeminent deans of the analysis of watersheds of the world. And they're good, very dear friends of mine, part of my advisors to my program. And I've advised them, and they had a display in Los Angeles about 2 years ago, and they were showing the impact of the melting of the Himalayas, what that's going to do for a large portion of the population of the world. And it is staggering in its implications. The melting of the watersheds or the lack of snowpack in the Himalayas will change the face of Southeast Asia. Every major river in Southeast Asia, its origins are in the snowpack of the Himalayan mountains. That's There's actually a similar analysis has been done in Europe with the Pyrenees and the Alps and the lack of snowpack, and now they're predicting trends that if you go across the face of Europe, where the desertification are going to be, where the agricultural belt will move to, most of it will be moved to more Eastern Europe. The south part, Spain and southern France, are going to incur, tremendous water shortages with the lack of the snowpack in the Pyrenees. And I mean, you're going to see the change of the face of Europe because of this, and people don't understand. And also, too, is here in California, we're fortunate this year to have a lot of snowpack and a lot of water, but that also can change, very, very quickly. And another danger is with global warming is the fact is that, let's say you have an enormous snowpack. I was watching it this year with the Rockies and the mountain ranges in the West, because the danger there was in global warming is that what if you have a really fast ramp up in the spring in temperature? You can have runoffs and flooding on a massive scale you couldn't imagine. And if you've ever up and been through that, I get the name of it wrong, the Hetch-Ketchy, help me out here. I know exactly where you're going. Yeah, if you go up there and you could see how vulnerable that whole region is. I mean, wow, you could have all you'd need is a couple of dams break, and surf would definitely be up. So, okay, anybody got another question?
You mentioned the Silicon Valley. That was a big boost to the economy. Is there anything associated, like with any of your wheel or your vision?
Ask that question again. I didn't quite understand what you said.
Silicon Valley was a big boost to the economy.
Yeah.
Yeah. The world economy. Is there anything associated with any of these processes that you mentioned?
Almost.
Be a big boost now, not 20 years from now?
A big boost or a big detriment?
A boost for the economy. Something culminating from all these sources.
Okay, yes. Okay, I'll identify that one. Where the opportunity lies in this wheel is this. Schumacher had it right when he wrote Small is Beautiful almost 30 years ago, is that we have produced technology and capability now that you could create a machine shop the size of this room and build a car. You couldn't do that a couple decades ago. You can have a place half the size of your living room and create a publishing effort that has every bit of the capability somebody has in New York at a major advertising agency, except maybe the printers. So you have the process of scalability. A friend of mine here, Grant House, some of you might know, he's on the city council. He has that marvelous little sewing machine shop next to the Sojourner, and I go in and pester Grant every once in a while because I want him to write an article. Can you picture the power of the sewing machine? Can you imagine? In LA Times just recently, they were talking about they're pulling back more and more garment production away from Southeast Asia, pulling them back into Los Angeles because they could have higher quality control. And so what, if they have to pay $1 or $2 more for a dress, they can actually control the whole process of manufacturing much better. And there's a marvelous book, what is it called? California Designing? I think it's California Designing, that shows monitor the crafts industry, for instance, and crafts have exploded all over North America. And you see people with their sewing machines and stuff, tremendous design talent. I mean, there is women and men out there who produce fashions and creatives and fabric designs that can rival any fashion house in the world. It's just that they don't have the name to go along with it. But, so what we have in the power right now is, while everything so much is in Silicon Valley, what we've created for ourselves is the power to mimic and provide creative, productive tools that can be placed almost anywhere. It's like my example when I said Kenya was doing the software package, okay, to help Japan in their recovery. Who in the heck would go to Kenya to buy software? No, I don't think so. I mean, they got an Institute for Advanced Physics now in Johannesburg. They went out and and got all these students around Africa who shouldn't be able to know how to do physics. Well, I'm sorry, they were really good at it. But I think the beauty of it in terms of community, when we start to think and plan a little bit better, we'll know the capability and tap into the creativity in that region and in our communities, and we'll see an explosion of creativity that's unbelievable.
By that 100-mile radius.
Yeah, by that 100-mile radius. Because we can, I'm watching these guys here in town, and maybe some of you know who they are. They have this little think tank about building electric cars and everything else, and every day, every time at Earth Day, they come along and they got new examples. Well, you see their fabrication techniques, and they're really sharp. I mean, I was really impressed by what they've done over a few period of years. Kat, you know who these guys are? I can't think of their names right offhand. But they're building all sorts of electrical vehicles and very innovative designs and stuff. And you know, sure, they're not building a Lexus, but you know, it wouldn't take much, and they could produce a really capable little dune buggy that'd be a heck of a lot more fun than a Lexus. Yeah, that's the ability. We have this incredible scalability now. Wired Magazine did a wonderful story, I think it was in February, on prototyping shops, and where people have these elaborate machine tools, and you go in there and you kind of rent some space for a little while or use them on an hourly basis. I'm not exactly sure how the economics work, but you can go in there, and if you want to do an engine block for a car, hey, no problem. Okay, we got it there, it'll do it. And it's almost similar to, if you go to Grant's place and these sewing machines. Huh?
He's closing it.
What?
Yeah.
Why?
He wants to get into, he's really interested in doing work in Africa or someplace like that. He's closing it. I think everything's up on sale now.
God, if I had a towel here, I'd start crying because I really admire the guy a lot in many ways. I got to go have a conversation with him. He didn't say that the other day when I was talking to him. Sorry.
Been in the news.
Oh, it's been in the news? Oh, I didn't know that. Anyway, these prototyping shops, and a little back to Grant, if you go in there and you want to do certain things with fabrics, you can get all these advanced programs and you just feed them into the sewing machine, and it'll make any kind of stitch pattern, whatever you want. Well, the same is true with these prototyping shops. You get programs and you can get patterns, and then you just turn it over to the automated machine tools and it makes them. But it's on a scale that's making it a lot more accessible locally. There's a wonderful book. I didn't bring it along with me here. I couldn't locate it in my library for today. It's called Natural Step for Communities. And what it does is show a number of examples that they've done in Scandinavia. Marvelous, marvelous stuff. That a community will focus on a few things and do it exceptionally well. And they are so incredible at it. They have no problem with markets. In fact, if you go to, what World Market, what's the one on State Street by the Metro 4? Cars Plus World Market. And you go in there and get those super addictive ginger cookies. You know, that whole thing is made by 29 people, and they export that all over the world. And I swear they spike it with something, because if you ever eat them, you'll never, you never forget them. But there's all these little industries in Scandinavia, and they've got global market. The one funny one was in Gotland. They said, all we do here is grow carrots. What are we going to do with carrots? And then somebody says, well, people really like carrot cake. And would you believe they're shipping their carrot cake now to Hong Kong? It is now a major growth industry in Gotland. I'm supposed to go there, do a lecture on that. And what they're doing is carrot cake, And I thought, geez, you don't have to worry about planned obsolescence here or spare parts or anything else. You just make the cake and ship it and collect the check. Hey, that's a winner. There's hundreds and hundreds of these examples all over the place. I was up in Maine doing research up in Maine. I've been up in Cortez Island, been in all these different places, and it's surprising the creativity that people can do. And the interesting part about it is, you go to these communities in Maine, and where they do things totally exquisitely, like build these old wooden boats. I mean, they are works of art, and their passion and their pride and their craftsmanship go into it. And you say, well, gee whiz, that's kind of out of date. I mean, I wonder, isn't it kind of risky economically? Might not have a job next season. And then you look at their order book, and they booked about 5 years in advance, thank you. They've got a problem with keeping the customers away, not worry about if they got to work next season. I've seen so much of these little endeavors. There's a wonderful other book that's from the slow food movement. It's all about artisan cheese. Small family farms that develop particular cheese-making techniques. These make small batches. It's not a big thing. But in almost every one of these cases is exactly the same thing. They sell every bloody thing they can make. And they usually have demand for it. There's a woman who showed up here tonight, and I don't even remember her name because I'm trying to get an order out of her Friday, and I don't want to tell you guys who she is because I want to make sure I get that yogurt and yogurt milk, okay? Otherwise, the rest of you are going to probably grab it before I get it. But she does the most exquisite goat cheese you'll have in this county. And yogurt, and milk, and everything else. I mean, some things I do keep secrets on, okay? I'm sorry, folks. I have to, for my own sense of preservation. But it's wonderful. I went and, when I was at Walla, they would send me out on these missions. I mean, it was one of the funnest jobs I ever had in my life because my job was to go out and explore all these different food crafts and people that would marry very simple things. And one woman was combining special wines with making special chocolate. And the only way you get her wine is you also order the chocolate. Needless to say, she didn't have any problems with ordering. Then one couple I met that was really cute is that they make this pasta and they spiked it with all sorts of very hot peppers. You could actually order this pasta with impregnated peppers. I mean, some of it was way too hot for me to eat, but you couldn't believe the clientele. They would ship all over the States and Canada and Europe, no problem. I watched this with olive oils. I watched it with, I can't even remember how many different things I saw, but nobody was trying to become, a major growth industry, go public, All they kept it was in the family. They made a very high quality item. They knew their markets really well, and they applied it, and they would have made a very good local investment. Very nice and very consistent. So these are heartwarming stories I've seen time and again. Yes, again.
Well, something else, you mentioned the word Monsanto, and I was just talking about this the other day, mentioning I haven't heard that much. I was in an area in Hawaii where Monsanto was big because they were trying to replace the corn crops and everything else. Are you abreast of?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story about Monsanto. An old friend of mine, Paul Hawken, you've probably heard of his name, was one of the consultants when we were doing the natural step that was hired by Monsanto. And he says, oh, good, when Shapiro was president of Monsanto, and we had a chance to change Monsanto, we're going to get in there. And so just as a creative exercise for management and the senior scientists, they went and said, okay, let's just do some creative kind of role-playing collaboration thing. We kind of get acquainted with each other. And the challenge was this, is that we're going to build a spaceship, we're going to go to Mars, and we're going to have to create a situation where you're going to have to feed yourself, you're going to have to grow your own food, you're going to have to, keep yourself replenished, and you can't call up for pizza delivery when you're on Mars. So what would you take with you? And so these guys started figuring this out and doing all these things as planning and ideas, and we're going to take some animals and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. The upshot of the end of that exercise, there wasn't one thing that Monsanto made that they would take with them. And that was the end of that consulting contract in a heartbeat. And by the way, they won't serve GMO foods in the Monsanto cafeterias for their employees.
Hawaii's having a hard time fighting them off because they come in with such a convincing, supposedly, study and everything, and mentioning that it's not going to affect future crops and things like that?
Well, I have a standard retort to that, is that fertilizer comes in many forms in the United States.
Remember that movie about Monsanto, the French movie?
Oh, yeah.
Remember the name of that?
No, I don't. The French produced a documentary on Monsanto that's a major condemnation. You know, this is a particular sad case because there was a Canadian farmer, as you probably, some of you may know the story here, who was targeted by Monsanto, and eventually the Canadian courts did not rule in his favor and went all the way up to Canadian Supreme Court. It was one of the biggest travesties. From a judicial standpoint, I couldn't imagine how Canada could do that. They picked the wrong guy because he's become a credible vocal spokesman for awareness all over the world, and he's been giving speeches and everything else and about the way he was treated. I also feel that speaking about judicial systems, there's some scuttlebutt going through the internet. I don't know how accurate it is or not, and I don't care to buy into all the conspiracy stuff that's going on. But the recent ruling against the employees of Walmart by the U.S. Supreme Court is now drawing a lot of suspicions that, you know, there was some behind the scenes, you know, pulling on that particular ruling, and that has come down very unfavorably, even within the legal colleges and legal professions, that they do not agree with the Supreme Court on that one at all.
I don't see any conspiracy, for one thing. Scalia and
Clarence Thomas.
Thomas. I mean, those were absolutely benefiting from the graces of Walmart, and they would just in turn, you know, rule for them to have class action suit on behalf of women. But for those who don't know the story of the farmer in Canada, I think it's interesting to tell that story, which is the seeds blew over to his.
Yeah.
He was totally, I mean, instead of him being able to go after them because they had ruined his organic farm, they went after him for stealing their seed, which was blown over.
And now if you grow with seeds with Monsanto, they put the legal liability on the onus of the farmer who used the seeds. That's the new scheduled contract with Monsanto. I think what's going to happen here, and I think that there's a whole new legal movement that's emerging, and it was triggered once by the Patriot Act, okay, when they insisted librarians, okay, record people's books they get out. And my expression is, the fact is, you don't piss off a bunch of librarians, okay? They can be a real force to reckon with. And it was because of them, okay, that the countermeasures and the ordinances were passed, and probably about, I don't know what the last count is, but I know over 300 communities in America, to ignore the Patriot Act and to negate it. And now then the second go-around was over the oil refactoring and the oil drilling, where they were injecting all these chemicals and contaminating people's water supplies, and tell everybody, hey, it's okay, you know, look at this nice check you're getting, $56.30, okay, for natural gas. And all of a sudden, communities, including the city of Pittsburgh, says, if you threaten the well-being of our population, I don't care where the law comes from, including the Supreme Court, you're out of here. And I think what you're going to see is you know, based on, there's a whole study in international law that's come to bear on this question, that do corporations, or even the federal authority, even the Supreme Court, have the right to encroach on people in such a way through the judiciary system that they're bringing into play things that are to the detriment of the health and well-being of the population and the nature and the ecology in the area. I think on that score, you're going to see a huge rebellion. And it's interesting to note with the Patriot Act ordinances, the federal government never went on to challenge that, because they could have won in the court, no problem. But the public relations battle, they would have been devastated. And they've never challenged any of those ordinances. And when the mayors of this nation, and frankly other places too, start to wake up and realize the health and well-being of their constituency, I think you're going to see a legal rebellion, and it's going to happen sharp and fast, and there's going to be no messing around, and the central governments, U.S. federal government, will have no way to stop it.
My question is about the transition
Mm-hmm.
from where we've been
Mm-hmm.
to where you see us going, which is a very positive vision, I think.
Mm-hmm.
What you're presenting is a pie that
Mhm.
we can all find a place and fit in. Do you think it's possible for academics or people involved in government or presently organized systems
Mm-hmm.
to slowly evolve into a better system? Or do you think it takes tsunamis of one sort or another to move us forward?
Well, I think that it would be unfair for me to tar and feather all organizations. If you look at companies like Patagonia, Gore-Tex, I got my personal training initially from George Norris, who was the president of Control Data, who gave me one of my first steps in enlightenment when we hired a whole bunch, 120 people, minorities. And it says, what's the criteria? Do we know their resume or whatever they want to do? And this was his exact words. Now, we're talking about 1969, 68. He says, all I want you to do, Bruce, is look for the light in their eyes that they want to do something with their life. Can you imagine 40 years ago, a top-level CDO of the most powerful, at that time, Computer Corporation of America with instructions like that? There's hardly a CEO today that would give instructions like that. And that's what we did. And we looked for the light in their eyes that they were going to do something with their life. And so I think that organizations have something to offer. I admire things that IBM has done. I admire, a number, I've had wonderful friendships with people in corporations and various organizations. I think a lot depends on the individuals in the organization. I think it also depends on certain the enlightenment of the leaders, the leaderships of the company. And I think and there's things to be learned from them. But I think this varies from place to place. From academia. Okay, look at the difference between a community college, a junior college, and a university. Usually community college draws upon people who've worked in the field, okay, have had some experience outside of academia. They bring that knowledge base together and they teach the students, like we have here at continuing education and everything else. It is people recycling and giving back to their community how they've been enriched through their lives. And it's just amazing to watch. I wish, there was a joke up in the San Francisco Bay Area that if you wanted a computer education, skip Stanford and go to Marine College first for your first 2 years, get a much better education. And I think that bodes well for looking at things that work within academia. Adam Green, who was head of the Sustainability Center here at the Santa Barbara City College, he says, Bruce, at City College, we teach practicality. At the university over there, they teach theory. I try to look for the light wherever it is. I learned a long trick. It says if you want to change corporations, big organization, make friends with the director of training, because he or she has risen as high as they'll ever go on the corporation, and if they're very good, they do what they damn well please. And there was a wonderful man I learned a lot from. His name was Steve Gage. He was the training director for Sun Microsystems, and he was so well respected in Silicon Valley, he could call any CEO from any company and they would answer, because he was so well thought of. He did television programs, included the competition in and everything else. He was an amazing guy. And then Ned Herman, who was head of GE, training for GE, he was really cute. We had involvement with him. I had a side trip. I was working with Bob Monroe in the Journeys Out of the Body Lab in Charlottesville, Virginia. And they wanted to introduce stress management training at GE with senior executives. Only they didn't tell them where it came from. They had this real good meditation technique. Okay, we're going to teach you stress management training. So Ned Herman brought in Bob Monroe and the rest of the crew. Got to teach them binaural beat and everything else. This was an absolutely wild thing that happened. So they got all these executives, all these senior guys up in the audience, and what happened was that they put them through this process in binaural beat and everything else. They didn't really tell them the whole history about where this program came from. And at the whole end of it, it was over and everything else, and then people back talking, and he says, okay, does anybody have any interesting experience? And this one guy up in the audience, he got up and he says, yeah, he says, I had the strangest phenomenon. The last thing I remember, I was flying over Manhattan. And we had all we could do to contain ourselves, let me tell you. I thought Bob Monroe was going to have a heart attack or permanent rib cage damage trying to block the laughter so hard. So, but what I've noticed about training directors is these people are incredible innovators, and they'll bring all sides of real cutting-edge stuff in. If they believe in something in sustainability, or they believe in something that they're really mission-driven, you see on the wheel, they'll get it in there somehow. They really will. So, anyway, so are we? I think we're pretty well.
I have one more question for you.
One more.
All these things come with problems, so for me, I try to find solutions.
Yeah.
And one is to be fearless,
Hmm.
then to replace the fear with love,
Mm-hmm.
and then create, I guess what Dalai Lama calls for, like, compassion and unity, and do it with joy. And so I wonder if you could speak to any of that, because really that's the solution, because it's in the micro, we have to change ourselves, in the macro, we can do it by coming together in community.
Well, I would say first, and thank you, Brian, for doing that, is that first, no matter what the situation, you have to find some humor in it somewhere there along the line. And realizing, of course, is that as humanity and individuals, we're still growing and learning. And if we would, as the poem Desideratus suggests, we treat everything with a little bit lighter heart, it'd make a huge difference in the journey that we take. And that I hope this evening I didn't dwell so much on the negative, and I hope I gave some encouragement to the positive. I won't know until I see the tapes what I've done actually. But I maintain a hope in everything, the possibilities, because if we're in union with the creative spirit, okay, that created all this, we're also co-creators. So it's also what we choose to create in the process in this journey.